comment about doing that.
Sorry, your audio got cut off. I hope it's not a sign of
like my comments about doing the heavy lifting.
Oh yes, yes. Laptops are now so heavy these days, aren't they?
Yeah, no, it's a funny old thing. Yeah. So, well, I'll just hand over to you, Chris, and take it away whenever you want.
Okay, well, fantastic. Thank you, Steve. Pleasure to see you all this morning. At the moment, I'm presenting with one screen, so can't see any chat or questions. My proposition is that I do a presentation. Feel free to put any comments or questions in the chat, and after that we can have a meaningful, useful discussion. I do genuinely hope that you get something out of this. Steve initially asked me to present something on leadership. I thought that's quite a broad topic, so we negotiated for me to speak about negotiation instead. In a way, negotiation is under-taught, is my strong opinion. Also, I think the negotiation with Steve and I for today was very easy. The main one is that Steve is likable, and I think that's an important thing in negotiations. If you're actually likable, it will help you achieve the outcomes that you desire. Another thing is that it's a great network, the Scottish Digital Health and Care Network, not quite got the acronym coming off my tongue yet, but certainly a shared vision. So we both have a similar value here, and therefore it was a very smooth negotiation. It was really no negotiation at all. But if you look at negotiations, you can think of hard negotiators and soft negotiators. That's really a bit of an outdated traditional view of thinking about negotiation. Now, what a soft negotiator would typically be is somebody who really tries to get along with the other people too much and makes concessions too readily. Whereas a hard negotiator thinks of this as more as a contest of wills, and therefore often will take an extreme position, holding out, and really neither of these options are particularly good. Obviously, a soft negotiator would give away things too easily, whereas a hard negotiator often will just induce a hard response from the other side. And now you can see that little diagram there, how we've got a soft negotiator with an axe. That really does just depend upon where you live in Scotland. It's thought that around 85% of people are able to compromise when it comes to negotiation, whereas only about 15%, the minority, have a rather binary thinking style of you win, I lose versus I win, you lose. So you may have heard of a term called principled negotiation. This is aiming for win-win, whereas positional bargaining is actually more saying this is a fixed thing that I want, and therefore I will bargain with that. Neither of these, certainly positional bargaining, is not a great tool. I think that it's clear parties can have shared interests, conflicting interests, or just simply want different things. And the key to negotiation is to try to get a common ground. And to do that, you must understand what the other person wants or the other party wants. And to obtain that information, it is really important to ask questions to identify where there is a common interest. So try and get negotiations off on a good foot, and be aware that although parties' interests may differ, over time an individual party's interest could change. So what I'm going to mention in this presentation is a bit about why negotiation is important, some of the literature behind negotiation, and learning points to consider. My background is as a general practitioner in Dundee, Scotland, also work as a clinical informatician, and I just like listening to audio books and learning. So I've probably read or listened to around 10 books on negotiation, and I believe that you all know negotiation is extremely important for day-to-day life. Now, one of the things I mentioned was to understand what the other party wants. The first thing that you should do is understand what you actually want from this negotiation and not to lose sight of it. Otherwise, what you'll find is that over time, your goal will merge or change, and it would just happen insidiously. So really be clear on what you want. The second phase is trying to establish the preferences and goals of your counterpart. Then you can almost make a matrix to think, what do they want? What do I want? And therefore come to an agreement. So I've got some pictures up there from Money Heist, an excellent series, which would be worth watching. But the reason I've got that up there is because it isn't clear what the other party wants initially. I won't ruin it in any detail, but I would just say it isn't clear what the other party wants, and throughout the series it becomes clear. But mainly preparation and focus are the two things I would be suggesting are extremely important for negotiation. So in digital health, if you think about negotiation, certain things will spring to mind. Clearly, negotiating a contract with a supplier, for example, or more often, holding a supplier accountable and agreeing with requests for change, trying to keep them in account. So this is an ongoing relationship with a supplier, and often these contracts are for several years. So what I've done, I've put up a picture of a classic game that uses a lot of broadband versus Teams for you all, of a game called Fortnite. And now, a couple of reasons. One, that was my best ever performance with 18 kills and a victory royale. But moving swiftly on, it's to put the contrast between Fortnite and negotiations. Negotiations are not like Fortnite. We are not really going for one winner, and it's an extremely important point to make. And another point I've got that up is because it is very important not to assume what goes on in somebody else's mind or their particular team when they come in to the table or the virtual table to negotiate. Because if I were to ask you, what's the dynamic in my house about playing Fortnite, you would assume the dynamic may be that I have to stop my children from playing Fortnite. That is true with one of them, but with the other one, I have to bargain with him to stop him telling me to play Fortnite. So that the point I'm trying to get is, don't assume, ask what the other party values. Now, you could also see that if you've got good eyesight, there's an old bottle of Valium, the strong ones, 10 milligrams, with Elvis Presley's name on. Now that was actually sold in an auction, and very briefly, because it's about negotiation, everybody thinks about auctions. So think of an auction and your negotiation. set your reserve price and stick to it. Don't fall for the winner's curse. This is when you buy or sell something much more or less than the true value. So auctions can be good if everybody knows the value of something, but if the value is actually hidden, it can be very difficult. In addition, bidders could risk overpaying by getting competitive arousal and actually bidding more. And don't think of other parties as competition. So if you're bidding for something, say a product that you're wanting, and the supplier may outline there's a lot of demand elsewhere and that you may be low down in the list, try not to think, get put with a time urgency to hasten your decision making so that you make mistakes, but also realize that the other people are not competition. They're just other parties who are interested. And actually, if you wanted a fair auction for the buyers, a stamped auction is a way in which the winner pays the second maximum bid. But when negotiating, just try to be cautious not to divulge too much information without the other party doing the same thing. So if it was all like an open book, it would make negotiations faster. But equally, if you give too much information and the other party is not providing that information, it could be detrimental to your position. Now, as I said, I'm a GP and I've got a bottle of Valium up there. So I have to really give a clinical negotiation. And this is very much a common scenario in a socio-economically deprived area that I work, deep end practice in Dundee, in which somebody is coming in demanding their medicine. Could it be diazepam or something else? And often you'll get various threats that will occur. And one of the best ways of dealing with this is to just actually genuinely listen. It can often be much harder to listen to things that you actually disagree with, as opposed to things you agree with. However, if it's something that you disagree with, this is the most important time to listen. At the end of the day, the other party won't be able to say that you don't understand them. So that's perhaps why often clinicians have higher satisfaction if they spend more time with patients, because it is all about listening. But really, you have to think, look, what would it be like to be in that other person's shoes? So I'll touch on that again later. I think negotiation also depends on whether you're going to have an ongoing relationship with somebody or not. If it's a one-off transactional relationship, you may wish to have more threats. Not that I'm suggesting that, whereas if it's an ongoing one, then threats would really not be very beneficial. It is a shame that many patients don't know that and instead would put a threat in there. This is an excellent book that I would recommend you all read. It's by a former hostage negotiator who applies what he's learned from many years of experience, and he's also been extensively involved with Harvard University, which are generally regarded as one of the founders of modern negotiation strategies. As Steve and I were lucky enough to have some training from Harvard University at the NHS Digital Academy. I've put some of the great points from this book on the slide. I think I draw your attention to this golden rule that is often misquoted about treat others as you would like to be treated. No, treat others the way they would like to be treated in that particular situation. The book also mentions bits about different voices, a friendly, playful voice, a firm, low voice, or just mirroring, using a few words frequently in a similar way as a late night DJ voice. And seemingly, if you're negotiating with somebody who's holding a bomb, the DJ late night negotiation voice is the most desired one. But it's important to mirror what people say. And by that, it would be echoing a few of the words back to them to really explore more, staying silent with some tactical empathy to understand their mindset. Labeling is important. So rather than saying, I hear this, you could say, it sounds like this. This allows you to dig a bit deeper. And I mean, this book particularly says, they do not want to hear that you are right, rather that's right. It has a little bit about different types of yeses, such as a confirmation yes, a yes with no promise of action, and a commitment yes. And I think drawing that to something that's likely more useful to you guys, who I assume are not bomb hostage negotiators, it would be to say, if you're negotiating and you get a yes, you want to get a commitment yes, to actually have a time frame and a strategy to implement these points. I'm just going to try and change this so that I've got my, okay. So don't use the word fair, because it's really something that is all about perception, and it's about what lens you see life on, what is fair to somebody. And also try not to counterattack. Don't accept that I will try. Consider saying, how does this fit in with the rest of the team? Now, virtually it's harder to read body language. I would encourage you all to look at some NLP, and by this I'm not meaning NLP in the digital sense, the natural language processing. I'm meaning more of the neuro-linguistic programming, which was popular about 10-20 years ago, trying to establish rapport and looking at the sensory modalities people use most. Prefer a visionary one, so I would see you rather than I hear, and some are more kinetic and would be in terms of touching. But if you are able to see somebody in person and you can see incongruence with different body language to what they say, this is the time to push for more information. And that's almost impossible when people are emailing all of the time. Now, I think rather than saying you can't afford something outright, you could say you've been generous, and then wait to see. It's not an outright rejection. So really, you want to be cooperative. Think of being a friendly person in which you like to try and close it to the end of a negotiation. You can use strategic umbrage. That's when you state firmly that you won't work at a level, and be aware of this. And another thing is, do not punch back. If somebody is aggressive or angry, very much try to de-escalate this. I've spoken quite a lot about that slide, so hopefully you have read the various quotes as well. I'll now mention a bit about knowledge balance, power balance, and the importance of preparation. So you'd be aware that in any negotiation there's a difference in power. Now, if you just were to look at behavioral economics applied to negotiation, it would often suggest that if there is a stronger party, they would likely be much more aggressive in terms of negotiating, and often they would give the other person a much less attractive set of alternatives. Now, equally, the importance of power, if you can just have a moment to step back and think, which is the more powerful team, it will help you here. Because if you've got two really powerful teams or two less powerful teams, these are all assuming it's one-on-one negotiation, then you're actually less likely to get bits in the middle that you could compromise with and aim for the win-win situation. But if you're the less powerful team, what you can do is prepare. The preparation can pay dividends. This is because an overly powerful team may not actually prepare because they just know they're the overly powerful team. So you can tip the knowledge balance in your favor to offset that power imbalance. The only loss of preparation is really the time spent preparing. Now, power, what is power, you may say, Chris? Well, it's the ability to influence the behavior of others, to get them to do something that they otherwise may not do. But it's always important to understand what power you have, and the other party may not know the power you have. They may overestimate your actual power and underestimate their own power. So it does go down to types of leverage that one holds in negotiation. And a positive leverage would be when you both want to do something. So this would be in the case of procure a software system and a supplier wants to sell a software system. This goes synergistically. Obviously, negative leverage is opposite to that. And really, negative leverage is trying to get somebody to do something by threatening them. Otherwise, I will do this. This is not recommended. And it comes down to actually a concept called the paradox of power. That's when you push somebody harder, the harder they will pull back. Now, you can also use something called normative leverage, and that's when you show inconsistencies between somebody's behavior and their usual beliefs. And that can be quite a powerful way to get people thinking. Now, if you look at cooperative game theory, people will say what they will do and then they will do it. This is not like real life. What is useful is to have a knowledge of what somebody wants or is likely to do in a certain scenario. And if you do preparation and research, seeing what people have done before, you can potentially obtain some of that information. So also be aware who you're negotiating with. So in particular, it's hard to understand the structure of many organizations, even if you work in them. But if you are speaking to somebody who is in theory representing a supplier, but doesn't actually have any power to make changes that you're aiming for, then really the best advice would be to leave the room and ask to speak to somebody who does. So once again, preparation is a paramount importance here. One of the first things I said was about being clear on your objective. Know what you are aiming for. You know, if you don't know where you're going, then it doesn't matter what path you will take, to misquote famous fiction. If you're negotiating with a team or against a team, things are harder. If you're negotiating with more than two parties, things become complex rather than just complicated, because there's so many things happening, it becomes difficult to actually predict what is going to occur. You may want to consider providing some concessions for minor things, which may lead the other party to reciprocate, in that they would then give you things that you value. And again, this could be, if you think of a supplier, the main thing would be a start date, a time frame. So if you're not too bothered if it's in 6 months or 3 months or 1 month, and perhaps the initial negotiation had started with a time frame of 3 months, perhaps pushing it out a bit, they would think, how generous, we'll do something to reciprocate. Usually deciding a location of a negotiation is important, but I would assume most of these would be happening online through Teams. But what you could do previously would be, for example, to allow the other party to decide the location of the negotiation. I think that also it is important that you want to try and save the face of the other party and respect them. I'll mention a bit more about the impact of emotions on negotiations. It looks like I made up a new word. I quite like that, emotions. But if you're angry and you're actually not throwing things around the room, sometimes that can be useful and can obtain more. This isn't a good strategy to go about day-to-day life. I must say, I'm a GP, keep your blood pressure low, don't do that. But if you actually do look at peer-reviewed journals, they do show the role of emotions on the bargaining abilities. And if you're feeling emotional, just try to identify that, regulate yourself, and it may be that you don't want to make a rapid decision that day and you want to defer negotiations. Now, there's a good word in the literature for Steve, proclivity. This is a tendency to choose or do something regularly. Or an inclination or predisposition towards a particular thing. So this is about trying to understand the other party's proclivity, just as I had mentioned. If there is a conflict, focus on the conflict, not the other person. It's too easy to be hijacked by emotions and then have some kind of personal vendetta rather than dealing with the actual issue and aiming to get the best thing. Now, there's an acronym there, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. You have to be aware of what your walkaway point is and what your options are. Interestingly, it depends on what you focus on as to how much satisfaction you get. So if you're an aspiration negotiator in which you're optimistic about what you can achieve, it may lead to better outcomes, but it may lead you feeling less satisfied when things have been completed. Whereas if you're somebody who negotiates whilst focusing on alternatives, particularly if you're the less powerful side, you're likely to get a worse outcome, but you may be more satisfied when the negotiation is over. I'm just mentioning that so you can be aware of both. And we do know that if after a deal you compare yourself with other buyers, even if you do better and pay less, it doesn't add to your satisfaction. However, if you're a seller and manage to sell for more than your rivals, you will feel better. However, if you then find you've sold for less, then you'll feel worse. I think we have to appreciate here the things I've mentioned quite often are feelings, and when you look back, memory is a difficult thing. Often you don't look back and recall what actually happened. You remember how you felt at a time. So let's assume you've had a successful negotiation, achieved what you wanted, and the other party has achieved slightly less. Do not leap up and down with joy. Keep this positive success under wraps until you have actually left. Otherwise, the other party will remember that and they will not like you too much when it comes to a future negotiation. Coming back to what I said at the start, you really being a nice person is of paramount importance. I put an acronym there, DBAD. A lot of this is a bit like life. Don't be a dick. That one isn't in Get Into Yes, but the BAFNA is. So really, the time pressure, as I've said before, don't let it become something that leads to a poor bargaining point. You may see the weird picture of a wall. That is about trying to reframe a situation, coming back to the NLP concepts that I had mentioned. Values. Now, each party can value things differently. So for one person, £5 may be a lot of money and it may be insignificant to others. Whereas, as I mentioned, delivery time is often a variable that could be negotiated with, or potentially the level of support that is provided by a supplier. So one, if you can understand what you want, your limitations and what they want, you can attempt to add value and it could lead to a good compromise. So if you can search for multiple issues that parties value each individual small issue differently, then potentially one can get the best deal for both parties. Now, some people would outline you should have a contingency contract, but that in itself can be a large amount of negotiation. I've got this nice little comic strip there, which is an example of anchoring and positional bargaining. Some suggest that could work. I wouldn't. I think if you put in a too extreme position, the other party may think of you as a time waster and just leave. But if people do that, and you wish to continue the negotiation, just be aware it's going to last longer. So this is a page, once again, from this book, one of the few physical books I've read rather than audio books lately. And it's worth reading, Get Into Yes. And this is a table that really shows the differences between hard and soft negotiation and includes this best alternative to a negotiated agreement. It also mentions a bit about how people can try and psychologically manipulate you. They may try to guilt trip you, intimidate you. I'm not suggesting that you should do this, but you could be aware of this and not fall for it. The good cop, bad cop routine is a form of psychological manipulation in which you're encouraged to take an inferior deal by somebody framing it against something that is far worse, the bad cop's offer. And if you're in a good cop, bad cop situation, the advice is to ask to speak to the good cop alone and say you will walk away due to the bad cop's behavior unless things change. Obviously, that wouldn't work in a police station, but the good cop, bad cop is in case you're encountering people behaving like that. Now, some people will also try and make you feel uncomfortable by saying things clearly aren't going well in the office, or if you're being up all night, just be aware of that and ignore it. Realize every other party is a unique individual, and you cannot assume you know what they want based on their background, gender, or ethnicity. And as I say, if it's a group, it is harder to negotiate because it may be that the group themselves don't have clear goals and understandings. So really talk to them. And an important thing is about making suggestions. If you make a proposal and it's binding, then well, if it's a good proposal and they accept it, great. But if you make a suggestion, you can find out more information. And really, ideally, you would have an objective criteria that you would use. Now, this could be a previous sale or perhaps a previous judgment if something has gone to court, for example. So a lot of lawyers' work involves negotiating on behalf of their client and trying to negotiate a deal without having a third party, a judge to decide. And I think just touching on lawyers, there are studies to suggest their happiness is quite low in part from their work because they're in high pressure time situations, which is a win-lose thing. And they also don't have that much control because they're following their client's guidance. But I think the main reason I've got all of these different shoes on this slide, other than if people wanted to vote which of those shoes I actually own, although there is only one shoe of one of them, but I have one of those pairs of shoes in my house. And it's to say you have to think in the other person's shoes. That is the most important bit from getting to yes. Stick to your underlying interests. Be willing to be flexible if it secures an agreement. Be well prepared and think about potential options. But by thinking about being in the other person's shoes, that will help you. So really the key points here, one of them is that, well, I've written a few of the key points there. I just mentioned that often at the start and the end of meetings, you can often ascertain the most valuable information. And that's actually why if you're being interviewed by a journalist, they'll often keep their recorders running when the meeting has actually ended. A suggestion would be to start with challenge questions. Focus on the problems and the opportunities the other party faces in the negotiation. If you can understand this, you'll get an insight into what they value and you can bring value to the table. After asking the challenge questions, you can go on to consequence questions. These would draw on both the positive and the negatives that may occur as a result of trying to overcome a challenge. By doing this, you can actually draw out information and craft the best possible deal. You may have heard of the concept of a black swan. This is an unknown unknown. People in the UK didn't know there were black swans. I think there are black swans in Australia. But if you can identify an unknown unknown that could unexpectedly occur, you may be able to leverage this. Ask questions, feel for the truth. Why are they telling you something at this particular stage right now? It may be that you could find something which you'd have as a leverage multiplier. You think of the seesaw that's moving something down. Remember, the party who has the most to lose really has the least leverage, and you may want to utilize scarcity as a negotiating tool. So I'd like to thank you all for listening. One thing I would just leave you with is that what you know about the other party is like a tip of the iceberg. If I've had the privilege to work as a GP, people may behave in a certain way, and if you can take the time to speak to them and get an understanding of all of these tribulations and trials and challenges that they've got going on, it's all hidden and you don't know. And really, I would say, try to understand the person, and I genuinely hope that that's been helpful. I think what you don't know about a person usually is complex and large. I do hope these principles have been useful for you and would like to thank you all for listening, and I shall stop sharing my screen now.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris, for that. That's great to get the insights from all your learning. I mean, I think one of the common situations that a lot of us are in is where we have a great idea for a project, a bit of software, a change, just enabled service or something, and we're talking to people who are holding a budget, and we're trying to argue a case there. Have you got any tips for that sort of scenario, the sort of approach that we should take?
Thanks, Steve. I think collaborating is an important thing. So what one often sees is that there's somebody holding a budget somewhere, whereas there is some other party elsewhere in the country holding a similar budget, and they have a very similar purpose. So that's where it comes back down to preparation. So if I knew, for example, my board was wishing to procure a certain thing, and another board may be wishing to procure a certain thing, there's the potential for collaboration there. Overcoming budgets are always difficult. Now, if you look at academics, for example, how they will sell their work, they'll usually have a 2-page or 2-paragraph or even a 2-sentence thing that makes a powerful impact to show this is not an medical academics, I should say. This is not an abstract thing. This is of paramount importance and should be addressed. So if the person is able to understand that actually by spending more money, they may save money in a different way, that could be helpful. I think a lot of it does come down to the often unknown consequences of something. So if you can get, the difficulty is, that's what it comes down to, budgeting. This is a budget, and it may be you have to put a more powerful argument for your thing than somebody else's, because it depends what view of the world you have. You could have the finite view in which there's a limited resource, or you could have a view in which there is not a scarcity of resources. But that doesn't really help if you come to ask SG or a charitable trust for more money and they've only got a certain amount. But I think that exploring other funding mechanisms is another way. So I would say preparation, Steve.
Okay, thank you. Colin, did you want to come in on your black swan dead cat comparison?
Well, just to thank you, Chris. The black swan idea, I think, is a staple of philosophy. But I was pleased to see it updated, that you've equated it to the unknown unknown catechism that Donald Rumsted introduced us to. It's difficult enough to negotiate knowing the unknowns, but yes, to be prepared for an unknown unknown is vital. But that it makes me think of the other thing we've learned from recent politics, which is the dead cat approach, where a completely unexpected item is thrown into the discussion to upset you. I think, is that right, Chris? It's just a distraction, and one has to look out for things that are dead cats.
So I think what I've heard this referred to as a straw man tactic, and it's often used in politics. So this would be somebody would be saying something, and the other party may make a wild accusation that could be simply untrue, but then the person, instead of getting their point across, is having to outline that in fact they didn't do something inappropriately on a Tuesday or something. So that's one way of throwing somebody off. I think the black swan, I'd heard initially from economics. I think there's somebody called Talib. I can't recall his surname. It seems my Google Home Assistant also doesn't know how to help with that if you heard it. But that's more about a concept from the stock markets and an unexpected thing that could occur with devastating impact. That's how I had heard of that. But I think a lot of these concepts would have different names, Colin, and I'm sure that in a few years they'll be rebranded as other things as well.
Well, if I can continue, a black swan is a critical issue, is an issue in logical philosophy, and in the philosophy of science, the black swan is an item which creates a category error. And this is of great importance in science because it falsifies the previous understanding. So I think that's rather different from the things you've just been describing. But useful for us to recall, because it still comes under Rumsfeld's notion of the unknown unknown. That something is discovered which is out of category, and so this perhaps bears back on the question at the beginning of your talk there about the scope of the negotiations. One has to try and keep to the scope, keep to the purpose, and not allow these distractions, such as perhaps this conversation, to detract from the purpose of the negotiation. These are all distracting tactics which a malign counterpart will use to exploit you.
I think that's fascinating to say, Colin. I've looked up, it's Nassim Nicholas Taleb, and he calls the black swan the impact of the highly improbable. But I think it's really good how you brought that back to the presentation, and Steve's wanting to come in again.
Yes, I made a note earlier on, you on your never split the difference slide, it's got a suggested email message saying, have you given up on this project? Mm-hmm. So I take it the book's recommending using that phrase in an email. I mean, if I got that, or if I send that, I'd be concerned that was going to rouse someone's emotions and get them upset, and that would be an unproductive way of continuing. But what's the sort of situation where the author recommends using that approach?
Thank you, Steve. That particular part was more if somebody has disengaged. So if you have attempted to collaborate, work something out, etc., then that would be something that you could do, which would potentially draw things to a close or could move things on. So I agree. It's a proposed email that is sent to have impact. It isn't something that I'd be saying to send all the time. In select circumstances that would potentially trigger something and a reaction and a response.
Okay, thanks for that. Anyone got any final question, Chris, before we finish? No, okay, well, just thanks very much again, Chris. Some great insights there, and I've certainly made some notes. I'll try and use again. I mean, negotiation, we tend to think of it as a thing that other people do. We forget that we're doing it all the time in our day-to-day life, and sometimes it's really valuable. I think the kind of 5 Ps of preparing for negotiation is an important one, which is also worth adding. And it's just thanks again for putting the time into this, and hopefully you'll be able to come back and do another sort of leadership skills topic some other time in the future.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you all, and take care, and hopefully see you all in person at some stage.
Bye now. You okay stopping the recording, Chris?